For thousands of years, one small group of people lived on islands most of the world forgot. And what science just found in their bones is rewriting everything we thought we knew about who they really are. If this story pulls at something in you, stay close, because by the end you might see your own history a little differently too. Picture cold northern islands, thick forests, rivers full of salmon, snow that falls for months without stopping. This is the land of the Ainu people. For a long time, most of the world barely knew they existed. But the people who did know them told one simple story. A story that felt neat. A story that felt settled. That story said the Ainu were just an isolated group, a small population that stayed in one place for centuries. Different from the Japanese majority around them, yes, but still seen in most textbooks as a side note, a footnote in a bigger nation's history. For generations, that was the accepted version. Written in old records, repeated in classrooms, believed without much question. But here is where the story starts to crack. Because ancient DNA does not care about old assumptions. It does not care what textbooks say. It only tells you what actually happened, written inside human bones, sometimes thousands of years old. And when scientists finally got the chance to read that code, hidden inside ancient Ainu remains, they found something that did not match the simple story at all. Something older, something stranger, something that connects the Ainu, not just to Japan, but to a much older, much bigger human story than anyone expected. Let's go back further to understand why this discovery hit so hard. Long before Japan was Japan, before there were borders, before there were nations at all, there were hunter-gatherer people spread across Northeast Asia. They followed animals, they followed rivers, they followed the seasons. One group of these ancient people is known to scientists as the Jomon. The Jomon lived in the Japanese islands for an incredibly long time, going back over 10,000 years. They made pottery with unique chord patterns pressed into the clay. They fished, they hunted, they built a culture that lasted far longer than most civilizations in human history. Then, later, a new wave of people arrived. They came from the Asian mainland. They brought rice farming. They brought new tools. Over time, this new group mixed with the older Jomon population. And out of that mixing, modern Japanese population history began to take shape. For a long time, many assumed the Ainu were simply the last pure descendants of the Jomon, frozen in time, untouched by outside influence. It sounded almost poetic. The last guardians of an ancient world hidden away on Hokkaido, the northern island. It's a beautiful idea, but ancient DNA tells a more complicated story, and complicated stories are often the true ones. When researchers studied the genetic makeup of ancient and modern Ainu individuals, they found strong Jomon ancestry. Yes, that part held up. But they also found something unexpected. Traces of ancestry connecting the Ainu to other northern populations, groups from Siberia, groups from the Russian Far East, people connected to reindeer herders, to Arctic hunters, to communities living in freezing river valleys far from Japan. Suddenly, the Ainu were not just an isolated leftover of one ancient group. They were something much more surprising. A living bridge between multiple ancient human movements across Northeast Asia. Let that sink in for a moment, because if this is true, it means the Ainu are not simply what was left behind. They are the result of ancient peoples moving, meeting, mixing, and surviving together across thousands of years and thousands of miles of freezing, unforgiving land. If you're starting to feel like the ground is shifting a little under everything you thought was settled history, you're not alone. Keep watching, because we're only getting started. Now here's where the mystery deepens even further. For centuries, the way outsiders viewed the Ainu was shaped by politics, not just biology. As the Japanese state expanded northward into Hokkaido, official policies pushed Ainu people to adopt Japanese language, Japanese names, and Japanese customs. Their own language was suppressed. Their traditions were pressured into silence. Entire generations grew up being told, indirectly or directly, that being Ainu was something to hide, not something to hold on to. This matters because it means the official story of the Ainu was never fully written by the Ainu themselves. It was shaped by outsiders, by governments, by people who had reasons, sometimes political, sometimes cultural, to simplify a complex identity into something smaller and easier to control. So, when modern science finally goes back to the bones, to the actual biological record, it is not just correcting a historical detail. It is giving voice back to a story that was silenced for generations. That is not just genetics. That is justice written in DNA. And it gets even more emotional when you look at who the Ainu believed themselves to be, long before any outsider labeled them anything at all. In traditional Ainu belief, the world is full of spirits. Rivers have spirits. Bears have spirits. Fire has a spirit. Even everyday objects were treated with respect, because everything was seen as connected, alive, part of one larger relationship between humans and nature. The brown bear held deep spiritual meaning. In certain ceremonies, a bear was treated not as prey, but as a divine visitor sent from the spirit world to walk briefly among humans before returning home. This wasn't simple hunting. It was a spiritual exchange filled with respect, ritual, and gratitude. This is not the image most people were taught. Most outside portrayals of the Ainu, when they existed at all, focused only on how different they looked, or how primitive outsiders assumed their lifestyle to be. Rarely did those old descriptions capture the depth of their spiritual worldview. Rarely did they capture the intelligence behind their relationship with nature, and this is where ancient DNA does something powerful again. It doesn't just map ancestry. It challenges old, dismissive attitudes by proving something simple but important: complexity. Layers, deep and ancient roots reaching in multiple directions. The Ainu were never simple. They were never just left behind. They were part of an enormous ancient human network stretching across freezing seas and river systems, from Hokkaido to Sakhalin to the Kuril Islands to parts of the Russian Far East. If you're starting to feel emotional about this, that's completely normal. Because this isn't just a story about ancient bones. It's a story about identity, about who gets remembered accurately and who gets flattened into a simple label by people who never truly understood them. If this story has already made you pause and think differently, imagine how many more hidden histories are waiting quietly, just like this one. That's worth carrying with you. Now, let's go even deeper into what the DNA actually revealed. Some researchers believe the deep Jomon-related ancestry found in the Ainu represents one of the oldest continuous genetic lineages in East Asia. That means, in a very real sense, when scientists study Ainu DNA, they are looking at a genetic echo stretching back to some of the earliest human populations that settled the Japanese archipelago after the last ice age. Think about that timeline for a moment. The last ice age, massive glaciers, sea levels far lower than today, ancient humans crossing frozen land bridges and cold coastal routes, slowly moving into new, unfamiliar territory, adapting to freezing winters, dense forests, and unpredictable seas. The descendants of those very early settlers eventually became the Jomon culture. And later, some of the strongest surviving genetic traces of that ancient culture would show up specifically within Ainu ancestry, tens of thousands of years later. But this is not where the surprises stop. Because alongside that deep Jomon connection, researchers also identified genetic ties linking the Ainu to more northern groups, especially populations historically connected to Sakhalin Island and the Amur River region. These are areas long associated with hunter-fisher cultures adapted to extreme cold, deeply skilled in fishing, sea mammal hunting, and river-based survival. This tells us something important. The Ainu were not isolated on a single island, cut off from the rest of the world. Ancient Ainu communities were part of a much wider northern network, trading, interacting, and likely intermarrying with neighboring groups across the Sea of Okhotsk and surrounding regions for a very long time. In other words, the old image of the Ainu as forgotten island people, untouched by outside contact, was never fully accurate. They were connected. They were part of something much larger than the small geographic space historically assigned to them. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the Ainu were part of such a wide-reaching ancient network, why did history remember them as isolated? Why did the simplified story survive for so long? Some historians suggest part of the answer lies in how conveniently that isolated narrative fit the political goals of larger surrounding powers. A people framed as isolated and primitive could be more easily justified for assimilation policies, land seizure, and cultural suppression. A people framed as deeply interconnected, skilled, and complex, that story doesn't fit as neatly into justifications for control. This doesn't mean every detail was intentional distortion. Historical records are messy. Old assumptions get repeated without question. But the effect, intentional or not, was the same. A rich, interconnected people got reduced to a simplified label, and now ancient DNA is quietly, patiently correcting the record. Let's pause here for a moment, because something worth reflecting on is this. History is often written by whoever holds the pen at the time. But biology doesn't hold a pen. It holds a record written cell by cell, generation by generation, waiting patiently until someone finally has the tools to read it correctly. If you've ever felt like your own story was told wrong by someone else, even in a small way, maybe pause here for a second and really feel this part of the Ainu story, because it might resonate more than you expect. Now, let's continue peeling back another layer of this mystery, because the plot doesn't stop here. One of the most striking things researchers noticed is how genetically distinct modern Ainu populations remain even after centuries of pressure to assimilate into broader Japanese society. Despite forced language loss, cultural suppression, and generations of pressure to blend in, genetic studies still detect a strong, distinguishable ancestral signal. This is remarkable when you think about what it actually means. Culture can be pressured into silence. Language can be pushed toward extinction. Traditions can be discouraged for generations. But biology, in this case, still whispers the truth underneath it all. It's almost like the body remembers what the world tried to make people forget. Of course, this raises a bigger, more emotional question. Identity is not only about DNA. Being Ainu is not simply a genetic percentage. It is language, tradition, community memory, and lived experience passed through real people, real families, real choices to keep culture alive, despite intense pressure to let it disappear. Ancient DNA can reveal ancestry, but it cannot replace culture. It cannot replace the resilience of Ainu elders who kept traditional songs alive in secret. It cannot replace the courage of community members who fought and still fight today for cultural recognition, land rights, and respect. Science gives us biological proof of deep, ancient roots. But the human story, the real story, was carried forward by people, not molecules. This is important to say clearly, because sometimes when people hear about ancient DNA discoveries, they assume science is now telling the whole story. It isn't. Science is confirming, deepening, and correcting parts of the historical record. But identity itself belongs to the living people who carry it forward every single day. If this part of the story is hitting you emotionally, maybe share this video with someone who cares about hidden histories like this one. Stories like this deserve to travel further than algorithms usually allow. Now, let's bring in another layer that most people never learn about at all. The Ainu language itself is considered a linguistic mystery. Unlike Japanese, Ainu is not part of the same language family. Its origins remain deeply debated among linguists. Some have tried linking it to other Northeast Asian language groups. Others argue it stands largely alone, a rare linguistic isolate, meaning it doesn't neatly connect to major language families the way most world languages do. Think about that for a second. An entire language, carrying centuries of oral history, spiritual belief, storytelling, and daily life, and its exact origins are still not fully agreed upon by experts. This mystery adds another emotional layer to the genetic story. If the Ainu carry deep Jomon-related ancestry, alongside northern hunter-fisher connections, and speak a language unlike anything clearly related to neighboring major language families, then we are looking at a people shaped by an incredibly long, complex, and largely unrecorded history. A history that existed long before written records. A history carried instead through oral tradition, ritual, craftsmanship, and now, unexpectedly, through the silent code hidden inside ancient bones. Let's take a breath here, because there's something deeply human about all of this. For most of history, the loudest voices decide what gets remembered. Empires write their victories into textbooks. Powerful nations shape the narratives taught in classrooms. Smaller, quieter cultures often get summarized into a paragraph, or worse, forgotten completely. But biology doesn't care about who was loudest. It doesn't care who held political power. It simply preserves a quiet, patient record, waiting for someone eventually curious enough and technologically capable enough to read it properly. And that's exactly what's happening now with the Ainu. Modern ancient DNA research is still ongoing. Some researchers continue expanding sample sizes, testing more ancient remains, refining timelines, and comparing Ainu ancestry with neighboring populations from Siberia, Sakhalin, and mainland Northeast Asia. The evidence suggests a rich, layered ancestral history, but many precise details are still actively debated among scientists. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It's actually part of what makes it feel so real. Real history is rarely perfectly clean. Real human migration doesn't follow a simple straight line. It winds, it mixes, it adapts, it survives. If you take one thing away from everything so far, let it be this. The story of the Ainu is not a simple side note in Japanese history. It is a deep, ancient, complex human story connected to Ice Age, survival, Arctic adaptation, spiritual tradition, forced assimilation, cultural resilience, and now scientific rediscovery. And we still haven't reached the most emotional part yet. Because for many Ainu people today, this scientific validation carries weight beyond genetics charts and research papers. For generations, Ainu identity was dismissed, minimized, or actively erased by outside authority. Being told your ancestors were simply a small, isolated, insignificant population is not just historically inaccurate, it's personally painful. Now imagine being part of a community that fought for decades just to have your existence formally recognized. In fact, official government recognition of the Ainu as an indigenous people of Japan didn't come until relatively recent times, long after many other indigenous groups around the world had already secured similar recognition. For a long time, the very identity of being Ainu existed in a strange, painful space, alive in memory and tradition, yet barely acknowledged in official history. Ancient DNA doesn't fix decades of cultural suppression. It doesn't restore lost language fluency overnight. It doesn't undo forced assimilation policies from the past. But it does something meaningful. It provides undeniable biological evidence that Ainu ancestry is deep, distinct, and ancient. Not invented, not exaggerated, not simply a modern political label. rooted, quite literally, in thousands of years of human history. For a community that has fought so long simply to be seen accurately, that kind of validation matters deeply. If you've ever had to fight to be seen for who you truly are, maybe type just one word in the comments right now. Just one word that describes how that feels. Sometimes the smallest reactions say the most. Let's widen the lens one more time, because this story connects to something even bigger than the Ainu alone. Around the world, indigenous and minority populations have often been reduced to simplified labels by larger, more dominant societies. Complex cultures get boiled down into brief textbook summaries. Rich histories get replaced with convenient stereotypes. And in many cases, it is only decades, sometimes centuries later, that deeper research finally begins correcting the record. The Ainu story is part of this much larger pattern. A pattern where ancient DNA research is increasingly giving quiet, overlooked communities a stronger, evidence-based voice in telling their own origin story. Historians still debate many specific details: migration timing, exact population movements, precise ancestral percentages. But one thing becomes clearer with every new study: human history is far more interconnected, layered, and complex than older simplified narratives ever allowed. The Ainu were never simply the isolated people of northern Japan. They were shaped by deep Jomon ancestry, stretching back to the earliest post-Ice Age settlers. They were connected to northern hunter-fisher populations across Sakhalin and the Amur region. They developed a spiritual worldview rich with meaning, treating nature not as separate from humanity, but deeply intertwined with it. They preserved a language whose true origins still puzzle modern linguists. And despite generations of forced assimilation, their genetic and cultural identity remained distinguishable, resilient, and undeniably real. This is not a small, forgotten footnote. This is one of the most fascinating layered human stories hidden in plain sight, right at the edge of the modern world. Now, let's bring everything together. When we first started this story, the common belief seemed simple. The Ainu were framed as an isolated, unchanged remnant of ancient Japan, a quiet mystery tucked away in the northern islands. But layer by layer, the real story emerged. Deep Jomon roots reaching back to Ice Age survivors, genetic threads connecting them to wider northern Asian populations. A spiritual worldview built on respect, not domination, over nature. A language standing apart, still not fully understood. A political history marked by suppression, resilience, and finally, hard-won recognition. And now ancient DNA quietly confirming what many Ainu communities always knew about their own deep, ancient roots. This is what makes ancient DNA research so powerful. It doesn't just satisfy curiosity. It gives evidence-based voice back to people whose history was too often written by others, simplified by others, and sometimes deliberately erased by others. The Ainu were never simply left behind by history. They were shaped by one of the oldest, most complex human stories in Northeast Asia, a story of survival through Ice Age cold, cultural connection across freezing seas, spiritual respect for the natural world, and quiet resilience. And maybe that's the deeper lesson hidden inside this entire story. History is rarely as simple as the version we were first taught. Behind almost every settled fact, there is often a more complicated, more human, and more emotional truth waiting patiently to be uncovered. The Ainu people are still here today, still practicing traditions passed down through generations, still working to keep their language alive, still telling their own story, on their own terms, more strongly with each passing year. And now, ancient DNA is standing beside them, quietly confirming what should have been respected all along: that their roots run deeper, older, and further than anyone outside their community ever fully understood. So the next time someone tells you a piece of history is fully settled, remember the Ainu. Remember how one overlooked people, tucked away on cold northern islands, turned out to carry one of the most ancient human stories. Because sometimes the truth isn't hiding in some far-off, unexplored land. Sometimes it's been quietly waiting inside the bones of the people history almost forgot.